It is time now for Session 1, titled Fragmenting Global Economy. What is the future of multilateralism? Are we witnessing an irreversible decline in support for globalisation? How will a small, open, export-oriented economy like Singapore's respond to disruptions to the consensus-driven, rules-based multilateral trading system it has thrived under for decades? More importantly, how can Singapore remain an enabler for the regional ambitions of global businesses here and the global aspirations of regional and local firms? We explore these important questions in this session. To moderate the session, we have Professor Danny Quah, Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He will introduce the three panelists who will join him on stage. After the panelists' presentations, we will move to a question and answer session. To enable more people to participate, we'd like to encourage you to be brief and keep to one question per person. Alternatively, for this session, you may submit and upvote questions online via the Q&A platform. May I now invite Prof. Quah and the panelists of Session 1 on stage, please.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for continuing to share your morning with us. We've just had a wonderful session with Prime Minister, and we'd like to continue the conversation that has begun. With me on this panel is Ms. Wendy Cutler, who's the Vice President, Asia Society Policy Institute. Next to her is Dr. Muhammad Chatib Basri, who's former Minister of Finance, Indonesia, and co-chair of the World Bank and G20's Pandemic Fund. He's also a member of the governing board at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And at the end, Ambassador Ravi Menon, Singapore's Ambassador for Climate Action, and the 9th S.R. Nathan Fellow, Institute for Policy Studies. Let me just jump into our conversation on the fragmenting global economy. What I'd like to do, if I may, is just take a couple of minutes saying three things about the transition from PM's session to the conversation that we're going to have. The first thing is to note that there's not just change in the global economy, but it is a fragmenting global economy. That fragmenting global economy is now both trope and reality of our times. The second thing I want to say in preparation for our conversation is that we cannot just remain at the level of saying it is a fragmenting global economy. We need a more refined calibration of how exactly that fragmentation is occurring. And I want to suggest two ideas that we're going to be delving into. The first is, what is the persistence? How long-lived is the fragmentation going to be happening? If we think about Singapore as a house, and a storm has hit the house in the sense of this fragmenting global economy, is this the first of a sequence of storms? Have we transitioned into a part of the universe where more storms will be occurring for us? What is the severity and the long-lived nature of the storms that are happening due to the fragmenting global economy? A second question one might ask about the fragmenting global economy is its breadth. Not just how extended in time it is, but how widespread cross-sectionally it is. How widespread and directed are the effects of this fragmentation? Is this affecting all small states and global cities alike? Is the fragmentation mostly US-China rivalry? Is the fragmentation mostly great power grievance at all the rest of the world? Or is it directed at us in Singapore? We need an idea of the breadth of this fragmentation. The final point I'm going to make before I turn to my panelists is that we have heard over and over how small states, global cities are price takers. We are small in the world. All nations are small in the world relative to great powers. So the question is, how much agency and influence can a price taker deploy? How much power do we have for determining our destiny? And I said that in the context of how decades ago, not on economics, which is going to be a lot of what we're discussing here, but on military security, Lee Kuan Yew famously repeated the proverb, big fish eat small fish. Small fish eat shrimp. And the best that Singapore could do in that reckoning was to become a poisonous shrimp. That if anyone ever attempted to swallow Singapore, they would find that it would be a painful experience and potentially fatal to them. In economics, as opposed to national security, what is the counterpart of a poisonous shrimp strategy? Or, as in security, have we moved on from poisonous shrimp to porcupine and to dolphin, where Singapore can be agile and networked and project agency and influence, as a dolphin does even against sharks? So what I want to do now is to, having made that connection, I actually have a spreadsheet in front of me. And as the answers my panelists give, I'm going to be toting it up in the columns that I've laid out. I'm going to begin, if I may, with Ms. Wendy Cutler. Ms. Cutler, you are in the unfair position of having come to us from the transatlantic region. We don't want to overlay on you all the things that America is doing in terms of this fragmenting global economy. But we'd like to get from you some insight, your insight, on the nature of the fragmenting global economy from where you sit. PM referred to how America had been the architect of the international system, but now America and other nations have found that it is a high price to pay to be the architect of the globalized multilateral system. What is your thinking on how we approach this challenge?
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's really my pleasure to join all of you for such a momentous anniversary year for Singapore. And boy, the world is changing. And I must say, for me personally, it's nice to get out of Washington. I haven't traveled since Liberation Day, and it's good to be overseas. But thank you for advising the audience not to take out their grievances on me personally. Look, we're about 6 months into President Trump's second term, and we've just seen really unmatched activity in so many different areas, but today I'm going to be talking mostly about the area of trade. And during these, such a short period of time, the U.S. has really made clear that we are no longer going to be the caretakers and the promoters of the global trading system, that we're going to do what's in our interest, and in fact, we're doing it. We're less concerned about what's going on in the rest of the world. The trade deals that have been announced so far have left no doubt that U.S. trade policy is really rooted in the U.S. trying to rebalance our trading relationships. We are more than willing to impose tariffs against other countries, regardless of whether it violates our WTO obligations or our obligations to our FTA partners like Singapore, and that we're basically prepared to tear up the global trade book on trade and kind of seek a different future. Now, it's easy to just criticize all of this, but let's be honest, we have been making some success. I count about 6 deals have been reached. The latest deal reached with the European Union. Just a week ago, people were saying 50-50, not clear at all whether the European Union would be willing or ready to do a deal with the United States. In fact, they were drawing up retaliation lists. But again, I think when folks sat down in Brussels, the same in Tokyo and Vietnam and elsewhere, I think when they made the calculus, do we just say no to the United States and go ahead and retaliate and do what, is in our interest? Or do we try and work with the Trump administration to find some kind of accommodation going forward? And that's what we're seeing now. This period is going to end next week. Again, 6 deals have been reached. We're not going to make those 90 deals in 90 days, but I suspect we'll see a few more deals. So let me then just, just very briefly looking back, one point I do want to make, and I think the Prime Minister alluded to this didn't happen overnight in the United States or even around the world. And in fact, during my 30, 40 years working for the US government on trade, I clearly saw a progression towards really questioning our trade policy and our leadership role. And many concerns were persistently raised, including by workers who felt that they were losing their jobs due to global competition, communities that felt that they could no longer provide the type of functions that they were that they provided, and unfair trade practices by our trading partners. And while there was some euphoria when China first joined the World Trade Organization, that died down pretty quickly. And I think now there's a recognition, at least in the United States, that China's not playing by the rules, and frankly, the rules don't even address the types of practices that China is pursuing. And all of this kind of built up, and I think really laid the groundwork for Trump, who has taken these concerns to new levels and has used access to our markets as a way to get what we want. So let me just make a few comments on, now that we're 6 months in, just some observations. First of all, access to the US market is providing us important leverage. Countries are still very interested in continuing to trade with the United States, even as they realize they need to accelerate their diversification efforts. Unlike the first term, the Trump team is on the same page. In the first term, we saw a lot of infighting and an agenda that took a longer time to implement. This time around, Trump and his team were ready. And therefore, within the first 6 months, the policies that they have implemented have been widespread. And also, unlike the first term, Trump has taken the world on. I mean, during the first term, he focused mainly on China. And now, big or small, FTA partner or not FTA partner, ally or not ally, he is going after those countries as well. The deals that have been reached have a heavy emphasis on commercial aspects. They're really not deals based in rules that many of us were used to. He's focused on goods. There is some emphasis on digital, but that's really the only service that comes to mind. The deals we reached are largely one-sided. We're getting the benefits. The other countries are benefiting from the reduction in tariffs that he's threatening. Our FTA partners are not being treated any better than any other countries. And in fact, I would argue, maybe they're even in a worse position in that their tariffs are already at zero, so they have little to offer in terms of tariff reduction. And I would also say that even though the deals that are reached now are dealing with many of the tariffs, we're going to see more tariffs coming when many of the sectoral investigations underway yield results. As we speak today, a U.S. delegation led by Secretary Bessent is in China, and they're Bessent, along with Secretary Lutnick and USTR Greer, are trying to lay the groundwork for a Trump-Xi meeting, probably this fall. People say around the APAC meeting in Korea. Relations with China got off to a rocky start. Even though we reached an early deal with China, it took a couple of months to kind of keep it intact. So now the challenge will be, what can we do with China that Trump and Xi can welcome when they meet? And this is going to be difficult. The president clearly would like to see some big commercial announcements and has talked about businesses maybe accompanying him on his trip. Secretary Bessent's talking about rebalancing China, and China becoming more of a consumer-driven society and less reliant on exports. But China itself is very different than the China Trump dealt with during his first term. Their toolbox has expanded. They're less dependent on the United States, and frankly, they seem better positioned to survive kind of a long, if it happens, a longer dispute with the United States. I don't know, am I running out of my time?
No, go ahead.
Go a little more. So yeah, maybe I'll just conclude and just talk a little about what's ahead of us. I mean, at some point, Trump's second term will be over. In our Constitution, a president can only serve for 2 terms. We don't know who will follow him, and we don't know what will happen. But one thing I feel very comfortable in saying is, we're not going to go back to where we were. We're not going to go back and be the global leader on issues in trade and climate, you name it. This is something that's really changed fundamentally in the United States. Second, I mean, you only needed to look at, a lot of people thought when Biden came into office right after Trump that we would go back and we'd be the same, and that didn't happen. And so again, I feel comfortable in that we're not going back. And since we're not going back, then the logical question is, well then what's in store, what's ahead? My hope, and I think we will find a way back into all of this, but it's going to be very different. I don't see us, again, becoming the guardians and the leaders of this rules-based trading system. But I also think that there are things we and others can do short of that to keep the ball moving ahead, and that includes either sectoral agreements or agreements with certain like-minded countries. But there is a lot that can be done. And I'd finally just say, in looking ahead, and I'll conclude here, is that I think as we go forward, we'll look for ways to blend what we still call a trade liberalization agenda with an economic security agenda, because those economic security issues have become more and more important when we talk about supply chain resiliency in particular. I think that's something that all countries, including the United States, will be focused on going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, for such a clear and powerful statement. Lots of questions to come back to, so let's do that. I want to keep the conversation going. Partidi, can I turn to you now? Implicit in what Wendy has said is a view that America has of the international system. As Wendy said, we will not be coming back to the old rules-based order. We need to think about a new one. Now, so the question is for you, do we think someone today the US or anywhere else, has a ready plug-in replacement for the old globalized multilateral rules-based order? Or are we going to be editing around the edges of it? So I want you to talk, if you'd like, about the architectures that we're putting in place in this region. But following on one quick observation, there's a vivid picture that many of us have of Trump 1.0, day one, where he tore up TPP, which was then going to be a vital part of the global multilateral system. He tore it up. He did not think it was a good idea for America. But when TPP, was picked up by Japan and others, he kept relatively quiet about it. There was no railing against how the rest of the world seemed to be building its own multilateral rules-based order, different. As long as it didn't wash up on America's shores, Trump certainly seemed to be willing to let it continue. Now, so going forward, we've got different pictures of how this new world system might emerge. Can I hear some of your thoughts on what we are doing in this region on that front?
Well, thank you very much, Danny. Thank you for inviting me for this very important conference and a very timely topics. If I may say, there are three issues that we are facing now. The first one is, as you mentioned, about the issue of the future of the multilateralism. The second aspect that probably we need to discuss is also about what will be the direction of this globalization. I like to quote what you wrote in your paper, that in the past, we do believe that globalization is pathway for the economic prosperity. But nowadays, it becomes a source of conflict, because if countries become too dependent, that's going to create a sort of like an issue. And probably the other things, this is also very important, is the rivalry between US and China. So with this kind of background, the question is, what can ASEAN countries, can put their strategy to manage this kind of situation? Because I do believe that this kind of situation may stay with us for quite some time. Yeah, so the question is, how do we work within the constraint? So let me lay out some of the problem and then provide some perspective on this. I would like to, I read what the Prime Minister Lawrence Wong on his speech at the Nikkei Forum, that he said that multilateralism gives countries agency. But the challenge is, he is right, but the challenge is the agency is now under strain. As I said earlier, the easy years of the globalizations are over, and trade and investment and now are tangled with the issue of the economic security. I keep saying this, that in the past, if you look at in the companies, people will focus on the issue of the inventory method with the just in time. Now we are talking about just in case, because we need to anticipate about what will happen in the future. And the economic policy has become a geo-economic statecraft with the tariff, export controls, and technology bans are today a tool for rivalry. And look at the US-China rivalry has hardened into long-term structural competition. So the fragmentation will not blow over. So it is operating environment for all of us, and this will shape ASEAN's future as much as Indonesia. Now, with this background now, let me try to address the next question is why ASEAN and its middle powers can play a role here. Yeah. For the ASEAN, as Prime Minister Lawrence Wong mentioned, the stakes are enormous. Yeah, because our economies are tied to China, for the supply chains, and also the US market. And not only that, our technology futures will depend both, I hope you don't mind if I mention the brand here like Huawei and Google, Alibaba and Amazon. And in security, US alliances, China's presence meet in our seas. This is the reality. So this duality creates a vulnerability, but in my view, is also leverage. Why is that? Because I think it is very important for us, for many ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, to change the strategy from the so-called escaping binary choices between US and China, from the passive alignment into what I call the active alignment. Yeah, and this is, I believe this is not only relevant for Jakarta, but also for the ASEAN approach. So not siding with one power against the other, it is true, but actively engaging both, nudging them toward cooperation where possible, managing competition where necessary, and keeping space for Southeast Asia collective interests. So what I mean by active alignment means turning ASEAN's passive assets. We do have this, our advantage here. It's geography, market size, as Prime Minister Lawrence Wong mentioned, and also diplomatic history into active capitals, that policies that allow ASEAN to shape and shove the US-China dynamic rather than simply absorb it. We don't want to be just a global spectator on this. So let me now give a sort of like a concrete example. What I'm concerned about this issue of this bilateral trade agreement is the risk of the trade diversion. Yeah, and I do believe that it is even more important for the ASEAN countries to cooperate nowadays, because with the bilateral trade, there is a risk of the prisoner's dilemma. We do understand that the best payoff matrix for all of us will be in cooperation, but because the self-motive, self-interest of every country, what we are doing is try to take the benefit of the relative tariff among the member of the Southeast Asian countries to take the benefit of this trade diversion. Yeah. This kind of situation probably will push us not for a greater cooperation, but in fact, what we need is a greater cooperation. So what can be done? Let me lay out about four pathways. Yeah. If a fragmentation here to stay, which is I believe so, as you mentioned, Danny, ASEAN and its members must build bridge across the cracks. The first one is to use a flexible issue-based coalition. When the universal agreement stalls, smaller coalition can still be delivered. So let me give a concrete example here. I'm sitting as a co-chair of the Pandemic Fund. When Indonesia hosted the G20 back on 2022, we were in a very difficult situation because at that time it was in the midst of war in Ukraine, yeah, between Russia and Ukraine and also some European countries. Was very difficult, was almost impossible to get the leaders' declaration. Then together with Italy, some European countries, we came up with the idea to push the agenda of pandemic. Why is that? Because at that time in 2022, just the end of this pandemic and we started to enter the so-called endemic, the issue of COVID was still there. So if we propose the idea of the pandemic, every country around the table would agree to support. So this is very interesting because this pandemic fund that Indonesia helped establish during the G20 get a support from over 20 contributors, including United States, Russia, China, and Japan. Yeah, and it is a pool resources for the global health preparedness. It shows that even amid rivalry, practical cooperation is possible when framed around the shared vulnerabilities. So perhaps one thing that we have to identify is try to identify any area that in which the ASEAN countries can work together. Probably we start from something that very easy. We find the common platform, the common agreement. Once people feel the benefit of it, we move to the more complex and difficult issue. Yeah, so this is what I call the flexible and issue-based coalition. Yeah. The second one is strengthen trade and cooperation within ASEAN. Prime Minister Wong mentioned that ASEAN's greatest untapped strength is on market about 680 million people. If you look at the intra-ASEAN trade, but still represents only about 22% of the total trade. It's far below the EU, it's about 60%, or NAFTA is about 50%. So there's a lot of opportunities on this. And by deepening intra-ASEAN supply chains, improving cross-border infrastructure, and harmonized digital regulation, ASEAN can become more resilient to external shocks and less vulnerable to being forced into binary choices between US and China. And ASEAN treats more itself as more bargaining power when engaged with the world. So my proposal is, probably it's rather difficult, it's like the uphill battle. If we start something to talk about discussing about the trade liberalization, for example, because not all of us will agree. But try to find a common platform, an area that every country in ASEAN will start to speak together. Number 3, pursue managed coexistence in great power competition. The US-China rivalry won't end, but it can be managed. So my proposal is, let's discuss about climate, about pandemic preparedness, about AI safety, which is, I believe, all the ASEAN countries need it, and areas where their interests overlap. So ASEAN can serve as a catalyst, framing cooperation as necessity and not concession. Last but not least, and this is the most difficult part, it's easier to be said than done. I like to quote what Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of European Commission, said. He said that we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. So the political economy become very crucial because the foreign policy starts at home. So if we want to transform the so-called the passive asset into the active assets, from passive alignment into an active alignment, we need to do reform. Let me talk about the perspective from my own country. Indonesia can take the benefit of this relocation, possibility of relocation of investment, in order to access the US market. The geofragmentation, the sort of like the ASEAN market. But one thing that we need to do is to employ or to launch the economic deregulation. Because the biggest challenge for us, the issue is more investment climate. Let me be open and frank with you. Even when I was in the cabinet, I kept saying this, that one of the main reasons of why many Indonesians become religious is because they have to deal with the government. If you apply on something on the investment, there is nothing you can do except pray to God. So we need to improve these kind of things, to launch economic deregulation, to simplify the bureaucratic hurdles. So I think this is not only unique for Indonesia, for many countries in ASEAN. If we do our reform, I do believe that we can take this opportunity. So last but not least, Danny, I would say that we cannot rewind the globalization in the 90s, but we can write the next chapter on where the competition is managed, not explosive. Cooperation happens where it must, and agency is shared and not monopolized by any single power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shakib. You've brought to our conversation many issues that we're going to need to follow up, but you've also brought some very concrete suggestions about ways forwards that we will need to talk about. Ambassador Menon, I want to turn to you now. When we began, I wanted to focus very narrowly on trade as a critical issue for us. But there are obviously many, many other global and regional challenges that are important in this fragmenting global economy. Your thinking and your work, both from central banking through now climate change, has brought you into contact with a large number of these very critical global issues. I wonder if I could get your thoughts on fragmenting global economy and what we do now on all these fronts.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny, and also really delighted to be here in this audience. I thought one of the striking things, starting from PM's remarks and right through the comments the three of you have made, needs some reiteration, which is that what is happening now is not an aberration. It is here to stay. That this is a fundamental change. the new administration in the US has merely given expression to what has been building up over 20, 30 years, not just in America, many parts of the advanced world, in Europe, and also parts of Asia and elsewhere. So this has been building up for some time. And so I think the first order of business for any company or a country is to understand that this is not an aberration, regardless of the results of the midterm elections in the US or the next presidential elections. I think it's a new trajectory, and in some regards, it will be a continuation. It may be new ways, there'll be new, hopefully, better ways of doing it, but it is a completely different trajectory. So the question is, what does this mean for globalization, which is what we've credited for the incredible rise in prosperity the world has experienced since the Second World War? And this future is not a given. And the threat to globalization comes not just from the tariffs. There's so much attention on the reciprocal tariffs and the baseline tariffs and the percentages. I don't think any of that matters really for the long run. I think what's really going on in terms of the downside risk is the broader rise in protectionist sentiment globally, the severe impairment of multilateralism, the rise in geopolitical risks, and a broader climate of economic uncertainty and unpredictability. These are really the poisons that drag down globalization, not just the tariffs. At the same time, to borrow a phrase that Chatip used about avoiding binary conclusions, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the world is deglobalizing. The law of comparative advantage is extremely difficult to dislodge. And we've also seen how global supply chains are so highly integrated that it is very difficult to untangle. So you have these two opposing sets of forces acting upon globalization. It will either weaken or evolve into new forms. I think both countries and businesses have three choices. You can panic and retreat, and I think that's a sure recipe for deglobalization. Two, which is what I think many are doing, you can wait and see, which is, I think, being helpless and to have to live with whatever takes shape. Or three, you can scan and try to shape things. And I think the third option is the one that we should be increasingly looking at. To scan the landscape, to discern the underlying trends, to seek the opportunities behind the threats, and try to shape things in a new way. And I think as a small open economy, as PM said, Singapore has no choice. You have to scan the landscape, seek to shape a new globalization. And as PM puts it, we have agency, and we must act, but we must act together with like-minded countries. So to start with scanning the landscape to understand the underlying trends. I'll make just two propositions. There are a lot more that we could talk about. One, globalization is not just about trade flows in goods. It has attracted inordinate amount of attention. It is also about services flows. It is also about investment flows. It is also about financial flows. And it's about talent flows. All six kinds of flows, cross-border flows, matter for the outcome of globalization, not just trade in goods on which tariffs are applied. And we need to understand the nuances going on in each of these spaces. The second proposition, I'd say, is that multilateralism, while it has been severely impaired, globalization itself is slightly different, and it could be much more resilient. What's multilateralism? That's the institutional mechanism for international cooperation among multiple countries. The WTO, the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, many examples. Those processes have been impaired. Globalization is much more of an organic process by which economies and people become interconnected through trade, investment, and financial flows. And it is driven by economic and market forces in search of efficiency and growth. Sure, multilateralism has been a powerful force to facilitate globalization in the past. It has been impaired, but it is not the only driver of globalization. And indeed, if you look at just the recent experience following the first Trump administration in 2007, let's not forget there were US-China tariffs in place then, and right through. And the tariffs were increased in the last administration. World trade saw record expansion to $33 trillion last year. Empirical evidence suggests that broad-based tariffs often lead to a reallocation of imports rather than a reduction in imports. And business people know this. They see supply chains shifting and configuring, not completely collapsing and breaking down. So, like water in nature, trade always finds a way because it's being driven by economic business incentives. Harder maybe, less efficient, more frustrating, but seems to find a way. And we got to think about that part of the equation. It's not a given that it will continue that way, but we got to think of that dynamic very closely. That brings me to how do we shape a new globalization? I'd suggest 3 pathways we could think about for a renewed globalization. 1, to think of a new era of plurilateral partnerships and cooperation. 2, to think about new resilience-driven trade patterns and supply chains. And 3, to think about new drivers of integration, especially in the digital and green economies. And all 3, I think, offer interesting, promising prospects. Plurilateral cooperation among like-minded countries. This is not a new idea. We also call it flexible multilateralism for those who want to keep the jargon of multilateralism alive. But whatever it is, it has taken the form of sectoral plurilaterals within the WTO framework, and it has taken the form that we know more about regional agreements and cross-region agreements. And Singapore has been an active participant in both kinds of plurilateral pathways and partnerships. The sectoral plurilateral, the most successful example of that is the Information Technology Agreement of 1996 among an initial group of 29 countries who agreed to lift import duties on a wide variety of IT goods. This was because it was hard to get a consensus at the WTO on this. This, in my view, is one of the most successful trade initiatives of all time because it unleashed a massive increase in electronics trade globally over the last 2 decades. It made IT products affordable on a massive scale, igniting the IT revolution that has transformed economies, societies, and enhanced people's lives. That's a very concrete example. We've got to think, are there other sectoral plurilaterals where like-minded countries can come together? Now, the ones that have developed regionally are very famous and well-known. The EU is the gold standard for what economic integration within a region means. They still have lots to do, and now with the new environment, hopefully Europe will use the opportunity to reignite the integration. In this part of the world, of course, we have ASEAN, and it's increasingly important to us. The RCEP agreement among ASEAN, China, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand is the largest FTA in the world. The next stage, can we think of region-to-region connections in plurilateralism? The EU and Mercosur last year signed an agreement which gives access to the EU for critical materials from Latin America, and Latin America access to US markets. This may be small, but it's could it be something that we can build upon? And of course, we've heard several references to the CPTPP. What if the EU and the CPTPP were to link up? That will be the granddaddy of all FTAs. And mind you, the European Commission has expressed interest in such linkages, and the CPTPP ministers have just said a few months ago they are seeking greater alignment with the EU. Now, if you can pull that off, that is a great plurilateral arrangement. The second thing is new resilience-driven trade patterns. Now, since COVID-19 and the Russian-Ukraine war, we've become much more acutely aware of vulnerabilities in our supply chains. Our supply chains were designed primarily on the basis of economic efficiency, cost considerations. But we did not put a price on resilience. And this is a fact of life. Regardless of what the US administration does, more and more countries are becoming conscious of this. And we have to accept this as a new dimension that has to be factored into globalization. The time-tested tool for effective risk management is diversification. Diversification of supply chains. I think you will see less concentrated trade corridors in future. But diversification, to borrow a phrase that Chatip used again, trade diversion, is another dynamic that takes place that creates new opportunities, new risks, new winners, and new losers. And we need to be, again, cognizant of this, scan this, and try to shape and get into those supply chains. One trend worth watching is nearshoring. Distance matters increasingly in trade now. It used to not. In fact, trade was the one that obliterated distances. Now distance matters if supply chains are at risk. And you do see, even in 2023, trade between geographically closer countries grew faster. So is this a new trend? We have to watch. Friendshoring, again, economists don't like it because it departs from comparative advantage. But if you are having exposures to critical materials and so on, you want to trade with friends or countries that you think you can trust and deal with. So this is another trend. And again, countries and businesses need to be cognizant of these very valid risk management approaches that are being taken. Over the medium to long term, maybe the most important consideration for supply chain resilience may well be climate change. Now this, nobody is paying attention to. All parts of the supply chain, from the manufacturing and production to transportation, will be impacted by more frequent extreme weather events, resulting in disruptions. In agriculture, shifting rain patterns and prolonged droughts will destabilize global food supply chains. Trade routes could be recharted, and we know with the melting of the polar ice caps, you get new trade routes and shipping routes emerging that will also affect trade patterns. So businesses and countries need to move beyond traditional risk assessments and seek to understand climate vulnerabilities in their supply chains. And countries now have new opportunity to collaborate. How can they jointly address transboundary climate risks? And this, I think, is probably one of the most important things that needs to be on the ASEAN agenda, because Southeast Asia is going to be hit very disproportionately by climate change events. 3, very quickly, driving forces for new integration. If the economy of the future is likely to be digital and green, which I think it will be the case, then there is scope for cross-border collaboration and seeking opportunities in these areas. The digital economy especially presents unique challenges, as well as opportunities for international cooperation to facilitate digital trade. Singapore has pioneered new collaborations with like-minded partners through the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the DEPA. This is the first of its kind in the world. And what does the DEPA try to do? It goes well beyond what we achieved in the WTO. It seeks to establish trusted corridors for cross-border data flows, because every country is concerned about its data. It facilitates end-to-end digital trade, right? From e-invoicing to e-payments through e-accounts receivables and the full value chain being digitalized on common standards. Align governance frameworks for responsible use of AI across countries. So these are new things that we can imagine to constitute a digital economy cooperation. The last, transition to a green economy. This presents new opportunities for deeper economic integration. Some countries are blessed with renewable energy. Others are blessed with technological innovation. Others are blessed with nature-based solutions. The law of comparative advantage comes in again. You can have much stronger green solutions, cost competitive, if there is trading in these things through deeper integration. The other thing about green solutions, they require scale to become commercial and competitive. And what better way to scale than to go cross-border? We've seen this in solar panels and batteries and electric vehicles. Solar panel prices and battery prices have come down 90% between 2010 and 2020 because of the internationalization of the markets. Scale drives costs down. Will we see the same in hydrogen? Will we see the same in CCUS applications, in nature-based solution applications? We don't know. But trading cross-border makes a lot of sense. Just as the digital economy took off earlier, 20 years ago, the green economy could likewise. And Singapore is again sought to be a pioneer in this space for green. We signed a green economy agreement with Australia, but I think there's scope to do a lot more on this space. Common standards for environmental goods and services, building on what the WTO has done already, but going beyond cross-border flows of green finance and the cross-border trading of carbon credits. These are all new activities which can benefit from collaboration across countries. Facilitate the cross-border trade of renewable energy. PM spoke extensively about it. I think this is the trading of green electrons across countries will become one of the most important elements of future globalization. And maybe if hydrogen takes off, can we harmonize safety standards to facilitate new green hydrogen corridors? And especially in Asia, there's a lot of scope for this, both Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Let me wrap up. I've exceeded the time. I kind of saved the most important point till the end, and I won't elaborate on it. The most important enabler of globalization, quite apart from all this other stuff I've talked about, is sound economic and social policies domestically to deliver shared prosperity. Much of the backlash against globalization in its various forms across the world has been primarily due to the failure of domestic policies to upskill the local workforce, to bring in new investments, to strengthen local spillover effects, and spread the benefits consciously. Many governments have failed to do that, and today they are paying the price. And why doing the right thing doesn't get you re-elected, as Chatib says. So I think the next phase of globalization, let's get that piece right. There is no global integration without domestic integration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panel. What a wonderful set of statements for us. Each of you, while being clear-eyed and hard-nosed about the challenges ahead, also offer very optimistic prognoses, offer very hopeful prescriptions about how to go forwards. This is exactly the kind of discussion that I hope we're going to get the audience more involved with to kickstart that, however, so that we don't burst out into an epidemic of agreement. I would like to be a little bit awkward. I would like to press each of you on the positive statements that you've made, not because I believe the criticisms that I'm going to make, but because we can have a better discussion going forwards. Perhaps I can begin with Ms. Cutler. You've described for us the composition of thinking in American foreign and trade policy. Right? And it's a policy that you've been clear about where some of it you feel is perhaps going in a slightly wrong direction, but other parts are optimistic and paying off. So I would like to press you a little bit about that. You've said that going forwards, the deals that America and perhaps the rest of the world will be looking at will be more of a transactionalist nature, no longer so rules-based. Even if America or Trump, the Trump administration, does not make its 90 deals in 90 days, there are quite a few deals that have already been made. My question to you is, how is the sequence of bilateral deals that are being made that are transactionalist and not following a multilateral rules-based system, how is that a success for us? It might well be a success for the Trump administration. How is it a success for the world? Now, let me be very clear. I say that with some trepidation. I know you are such an internationalist. You are such a good friend of Singapore and all the rest of the world. And when you say, we are making progress on this, I need to know who the we is. Because for some of us who are small states, getting involved in a sequence of bilateral deals is not a good thing. We get taken advantage of. We want to go back to the level playing field. That's the multilateral rules-based order. So a move away from that, while it might be a success for the United States, is not a success for the rest of us. Can you help say a little bit more about how you see this being beneficial for everyone?
Okay. It's a tough question because through the lens of the United States, this is very U.S. focused,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's all but it's also based on a U.S. perception that the U.S. kind of wrote the check for globalization, for the first 60, 70 years, and those days are over, and now other countries have to pay as well. So some of it is just kind of getting the balance right, getting it, more, equalizing it a bit. But clearly the deals that are being reached, in my view, as a former trade negotiator, I think they're going to be very short-lived. I mean, the whole thing about a transactional deal, you're dealing with things that are on your plate today, things that you can explain to the public with big numbers and big price tags. But are you really trying to shift things for the medium and long term? When I look at Trump 1.0, and I look at the U.S.-China Phase 1 deal that Ambassador Lighthizer negotiated, he was, a staunch supporter and actor in the Trump team. He was not interested in the purchasing part of the U.S.-China deal that for Trump was probably the most important, that he could go out there and say China agreed to buy $200 billion of U.S. goods over 2 years. For Lighthizer, it was more about writing those rules with China so they would be impactful not for today, not just for today, but would have a longevity. And that's kind of, a struggle or conflict in these trade agreements. But now Lighthizer's not there, and Trump is, as I mentioned, is just more in control. He's brought folks in who are not going to challenge him on this stuff. And for him, when he looks at these trade deals, again, it's about numbers, it's about announcements, it's about showing that we're no longer paying everything that other countries have to pay.
Okay, I'd like to press you just a little bit more on this. In most actions that involve multi-parties, we want to think about there being a sense of proportionality, right? And I can understand how America feels aggrieved at, in its perception of China having undermined the rules of the rules-based order. So it's aggrieved at China. Why take it out on the rest of the world? Why have a Liberation Day tariffs that strikes out at 200 countries, some of which include my penguin friends at Heard Island and McDonald Islands, who have done nothing against the United States? In Singapore, there's a bilateral, as you know, a bilateral trade deficit that Singapore runs. America wins. Why is this lashing out the rest of the world a proportionate, sensible response?
It's a good question. I don't know if I'm really the right one to answer it because I kind of agree with you. I will say, though, that the formula that the Trump administration agreed on when, on Liberation Day, when they assigned these tariffs, it was this neat formula, but it had no leeway. Neat not meaning cool, neat meaning, it was very specific. But it had very little to do, and there was no consideration given to, is this country a free trade agreement partner? How much do we trade with this country? All these considerations that one should take into mind when they're setting policies against individual countries. And so when I look back on Liberation Day, I wonder if they'd come up with a formula that somehow would have allowed that delta to bring in these other factors, number one. But number two, start with a group of countries. Why take on the whole world at once? Why not look at the countries either with, the biggest trade deficits, the most egregious unfair trade practices, and start there. And by doing that, you put the rest of the world on notice that we may be going after you. But why why do it all at once? And now, by next week, supposedly letters are going to go to these other countries with these numbers. And frankly, I think a number of countries are just going to be scratching their heads, wondering, like exactly what you said, what did we do? And even when we even tried to approach the Trump administration, we were told that there was no time for us, that we're too busy. And so I think there is a lot of frustration around the world. But again, from our large trading partners, with all that frustration and unhappiness, we've seen deals with Japan and the EU reached in the past week. And they must have reached that calculus that they're better off with a deal with the Trump administration, even if they don't like it, versus not having a deal and opening themselves up to retaliation, counter-retaliation, uncertainty, and actions that are not limited to the trade lane.
Thank you very much. We're going to come back to these issues, obviously, but Chatev, I'd like to turn to you now. You've given us a wonderful overview of the panorama of possibilities. You've talked about ASEAN, you've talked about middle powers, you've talked about, in words that I use as opposed to yours, pathfinder ways to create better multilateralism, to create flexible multilateralism. You've talked about our inducing cooperation, even if we can't get explicit collaboration. So my question to you is, in these situations, historically, we have relied on leadership. We have relied on leadership that's either knocked people's heads together when they're not being sensible, or written down the agenda so that we can see the way ahead. Now, in the view of how the world is big fish, shrimp, big fish eat small fish eat shrimp, there is no leadership. You can't just jettison the great powers and then rely on middle powers, because when it's the middle powers, they become the small fish eating the shrimp. So what is in your construction of ASEAN, RCEP, the rest of CPTPP, how do you see that we can maintain the right kind of leadership? What are the incentives that will make middle powers be good leaders rather than become, as previously, hegemonic exploiters?
Well, this is a very tough question, Danny, because it's easier to be said than done. Yeah. Let me put it this way. We do understand that the best, as I mentioned to you, the best payoff matrix will be the cooperation. But the challenge is always about the issue of the political economy, because in so many countries, they are focusing on the domestic issue. So let me be specific on ASEAN. Naturally, if you're talking about the leadership of ASEAN, Indonesia should take the leadership, because the size of the economy, the number of population, geographical, geopolitical situation, for example. But the challenge is, it's not always easy for Indonesia, because we have to deal with the domestic issues. I couldn't agree more with you that leadership is very important. But I'm humbled by the political reality. Rather than blaming there is no leadership, it is very important for us to incentivize leaders to support the reform. So let me put it this way. In the past, for example, like under President Jokowi's administration, his main agenda was infrastructure development. So if you expect Indonesia will take the leadership of ASEAN, then maybe one of the agenda that we can discuss is about connectivity among ASEAN countries. Because this agenda fits well with the national agenda. Now the issue is how to find the entry point to incentivize leaders in the region, to jump in. And I can see nowadays a couple of important issues that probably will be the interests of the many leaders among the ASEAN countries. For example, as Rafi mentioned, the climate issue, this is something that inevitable, that every country in Southeast Asia will be affected by that. So let's start to discuss about this issue, for example, to take the leadership. So my approach is a very pragmatic. It's like a building block rather than sort of like to try to address some issues. Yeah, start with the building block. Start with the climate. Rafi, he gave a good example about how comparative advantage can work. Because some countries have this comparative advantage on the renewable energy, the other will provide the supply chains. With these kind of things, I do believe that countries can sort of like, can address this issue. And Indonesia can take the leadership on this because if you look at about the impact of this climate, our country will be disproportionately, impacted by this climate issue. The second aspect, as I mentioned to you, about the pandemic, or the IT, the AI security, it's become a big issue now in every country in ASEAN. So back to your question again, into the leadership, I don't have the specific answer to this. It's sort of like, it's like a specific framework, but my approach is try to find an area in which that leaders from Indonesia will be incentivized to support this idea. President Prabowo, for example, last April, he was mentioning about the importance of the economic deregulation. Yeah, he would like to convert import quota into tariff to remove the local content requirement. Let's work on that particular issue, which is probably will be the interest of Indonesia. So I'm being pragmatic on this. I hope I respond to your question.
Thank you very much, Pak. A wonderful answer. Your answer about leadership also segues into what I'd like to ask Ambassador. Ravi, you so vividly lay out for us a vision of the new trade and the new comparative advantage we need to transition into. It draws on the new industries, it draws on digital and green, scale economies. It's a whole new way of thinking from traditional resource-based comparative advantage. And that's very, very optimistic going forward. You also mentioned resilience as being an important ingredient here. My question to you is, these transitions, as well as the injection of resilience, are fully aligned with what businesses, private agents, and governments want to do. It's not difficult to imagine we could eventually get there. In finance, we used to talk only about maximizing return. Now we talk about maximizing risk-adjusted return. It's very easy to think we could go from efficiency in trade, comparative advantage, to resilience-adjusted efficiency, resilience-adjusted comparative advantage. That's possible. The critical nub of it is the last point that you raised, which is how we get governments, leaders, communities to make all this an inclusive transition. The great tragedy of the last 80 years of the practice of comparative advantage is that we did not. Right? As a result of that, both right-wing and left-wing populism have risen across the world. People are angry with each other, and nations are angry at other nations, even with trade going on, even with the globalization going on. So my question to you is, to pick up on your very last concluding point, what do you see as the mechanisms we need to build to make sure that leaders, communities, governments make this new trade inclusive when for the last 8 decades, faced with exactly this challenge, we have failed so abysmally?
Well, I think there are many things that can be done, and there are several examples, and the examples come from mostly small countries, in a sense. Smaller European countries have done this well. Switzerland, Denmark, the Nordic countries. Singapore, I think, has done a decent job at this. It's all about making sure and watching very closely that the benefits of globalization are spread as evenly as possible, that they percolate across the economy. Now, and Singapore has been more open to the forces of globalization than almost any other countries. GDP is, trade is 3.5 times of GDP. In 1987, when I started work, Singapore was the world's largest producer of Winchester disk drives. I don't know how many of you remember Winchester disk drives. There aren't any. We were the largest producer. Seagate and I know several other players put their manufacturing bases here. And we were the largest producer. 10, 15 years later, that had been overtaken. It's gone into chips. And we went into chips. The industrial structure of Singapore has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. If you go down to, beyond looking at manufacturing and services, if you look within each, it has changed dramatically. What do? We continually reinvested, we continually reskilled workers, gave people opportunities to move across. The labor market needs a lot of facilitation. Denmark is another shining example of active labor market policies, where there is a good mix of security and flexibility. Worker training, worker adjustments, career facilitations are very important. At the same time, you follow the law, the economics of businesses, and allow labor resources to move without trying to protect jobs. And so a strategy of protecting workers and equipping workers and empowering workers, much more resilient, much more durable in the new age than trying to protect jobs, which are going to be under pressure anyway. Investment flows, financial flows. You've got to manage these things domestically. Many countries get into serious problems because they don't manage these external flows very well. And so, again, that is another part of domestic integration, to make sure that the financial flows and the investment flows are managed well, the risks are managed well, and that the benefits spread across the system. People flows is probably the most sensitive part of globalization. And here we have our own challenges. We know we need global talent to come here. We want to be a magnet for global talent. And yet, if you don't integrate them well, you have problems. And so now we're working very hard to address some of those problems. One of the tragedies in Europe is that they have not integrated foreigners well into their communities. And you have enclaves, and you have social unrest, and you have dispersion in society. So I think we need to pay a lot more attention to domestic economic and social policies in every country, and not take a laissez-faire attitude towards what the outcome of globalization is going to be. I think that awareness has grown. I think there are examples in some places. No one's done it perfectly, and we've got to continue to learn this. And I hope in the large countries, in the UK, in France, in Germany, and the United States too, that you start thinking of resuscitating communities that have been devastated in many ways by not just competition, but technology. And artificial intelligence will be another great boost to efforts to continually upskill and upgrade and reorientate industries and businesses.
Okay, I want to turn to the audience, but I just need a one-word answer from each of you, if I may. Just to speak to Ravi's last point. Ravi, you've pointed out so beautifully the problem, but I want to know the solution. An easy way for political mechanisms to respond to these challenges is to make an enemy of the foreigner. Right? So in the US, it is China that, borrowing your image, stealing our jobs, destroying our industry, turning into ghost towns our communities. China does not have a political voice in that system to respond to that. So if each of you were the designers of the political system to obviate this problem, what is the one thing that you need to build into the incentive for your political system that would solve it? And can I just have a one-word answer? And then I'm going to turn to everyone else. Ravi, since you began us on this, maybe I can get that answer from you.
Very active public, private, and people sector partnerships that co-create solutions. So
Excellent.
It's insulated from political whims.
Excellent. Pak Didi?
I think the biggest challenge nowadays for many countries all over the world is the climate issue. That's the area that we can work together.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Cutler, you're in the maelstrom of this.
I think more government funding.
Government funding helps. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I want to turn now to the audience. First, I'm going to begin over here. Tommy Ko. Tommy, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Sorry, the camera was in my way. Many apologies. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Hua, and thank you very much to the panelists as well. And I'm honored to have people standing behind me. I'm Joelle from Hwa Chong Institution College Section, and on the topic of regional cooperation, I'm curious, how is the US balancing advancing interests in the Asia-Pacific with countering the influence of China? As we've seen some examples in trade deals struck with Vietnam, one of China's biggest trading partners. And on this note, considering China's interest in building a new world order and increasing cooperation with ASEAN, what are the reservations ASEAN has with regard to cooperation with both China and the US? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's collect a few, and then I'm just going to ask the whole panel. So I'm going to switch over to this side, please. Go ahead, yeah.
Hello, hi. Thank you so very much for this insightful panel discussion. This is Riyadh. I am from American Chamber of Commerce in Bangladesh. So I have a very specific question to ask. May I? How should smaller but yet promising economies like Bangladesh or Vietnam navigate the risk and opportunities of friendshoring and regional segmentation?
Thank you very much. Good, precise question. I'm going to go in back. I'm going to have three, and then I'm going to come back to Tommy, if I may. So go ahead. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Fairuz De Cruz from Yayasan Mendaki in Singapore. I have three questions.
No, just one. I'm sorry.
Just one? Sure, sure. I think I'd like to get from an American perspective, how can, if it's possible to get three strategies of how can ASEAN take advantage of the changing global economy?
Okay, thank you. Actually, since there are 4 mics, let's take 4, and then I'll ask the panel. So back there, yes, please.
This is a question for the whole panel or the Indonesian minister in particular. You mentioned that nationalism and politics within domestic economy was going to be intangible in this this question of integration for the region. You know? So can you elaborate upon this? Will this be a big stumbling block for an ex-politician?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to allow Tommy his question, and then we'll turn to the panel. Tommy?
I want to ask my friend Wendy Cutler to forgive me before I pose the question. The conclusion I've come to listening to the panel is that we have a new paradigm in the world. And the new paradigm is a world without America. America is against free trade, but free trade is not dead. America is against globalization, globalization is not dead. America is against multilateralism, multilateralism is not dead. America is withdrawn from WHO, WHO is not collapsed. America is withdrawn from Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement is alive and well. So my point to the panel is, America is important, but it is not indispensable. And we should get used to the idea of a world without America.
Thank you, Tommy. But what is your question? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Can I turn to the panel now? You can respond to any or all of these, but I'd like to begin with you, Wendy.
Okay, so on that last point, look, America is a country of diverse folks. We have a Congress, we have a president, we have different, local governments, et cetera. So when you say America, there isn't really one America. Right now, Donald Trump is our president, and these are the policies he's pursuing. Do they have unanimous support in America? No. So I would just urge everyone, maybe you don't like some of the stuff we're doing now, but that doesn't mean the world doesn't need or doesn't want or America can't help, and America's not going to become part of the world or change, looking forward. So I would just caution everyone to avoid kind of this black and white kind of description of where things stand. And I wanted to also just talk about U.S.-China for a minute. And again, particularly given, I think we've heard so much about tariffs in all countries in the past 90 days. Now, I think there's going to be a lot of focus on U.S.-China, given, again, the meeting that's going on today in Stockholm, but particularly as we look ahead to a possible Trump-Xi meeting. And here, they're just conflicting signs, because on one hand, we're asking our trading partners, particularly in ASEAN, to reduce Chinese content in the goods they sell to the United States. And so we are pursuing that, but at the same time, it seems that there's a good possibility that we may be looking for ways to improve ties with China that would be announced during a Trump-Xi meeting. I don't think we're going to get to a point where we're going to be best friends, but maybe a recognition there are certain things that we can do together. And so I would pay attention to this, because I don't think we have the answer yet on where U.S.-China relations are going under Trump 2.0. And I think there are some conflicting signs. I personally think one of the worst outcomes would be for ASEAN or other countries would be that we force other countries through these trade agreements to, again, take very draconian measures against Chinese content, while at the same time we celebrate a big deal with China. I personally hope that doesn't happen, and that we find some middle ground, both with our trading partners, but also with China.
Thank you, Wendy. Powerful answer. Thank you. Chatip?
Well, I think let me address the question about this economic nationalism. First, economic nationalism is everywhere. This is not only unique in Asia. If you're talking about the United States, MAGA is basically an economic nationalism as well. Now, the question is, given at this political constraint, what can be done? One thing that I believe that many of us overlook is about the role of the consumers, right? Every producers are consumers, but not necessarily every consumers are producers. So if you look at from this perspective, the role of the consumers is very important, because they gain something from this trade integration, from the globalization. So let me give a concrete example. A country like Indonesia, we are always discussing about the self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency in the old definitions means that locally produced. But maybe in the future, we can define this self-sufficiency is not only locally produced, but locally owned. What does it mean? This is one part of the agreement with the United States. Indonesia will invest in energy in the United States. To secure the supply from energy in the United States, it means that if we opening up import, it's not locally produced, but it's locally owned. By doing this, Indonesia will become the part of the global player. In the case of self-sufficiency of rice, maybe it's about the time for Indonesia to start to invest on paddy field, maybe in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Vietnam. Every time we need a rice, we import from our own companies. So we still need to address the issue of this economic nationalism, but the way we define, we put it in the context of the global supply chains. I hope I respond to your question.
Thank you, Pak. Now, I know we've run out of time, but Ravi, I want to get you to respond before we finish up. So any or all of these 5 questions that are on the table?
It's a wide spread of questions, but underlying many of the questions is a sense of what can governments do, what can the US do, and so on. And in the absence of leadership, what can be done? I think we just have to accept there is no leadership. But the world has to go on, our lives have to go on, and we need to continue to grow. And so we need to learn to operate in a world like that. I mentioned public-private people partnerships as a way in which you can advance on things where there is not yet a political consensus or governments find it difficult to do. I've also mentioned that what we need internationally across countries is more coalitions of the willing. 3, 4 countries coming together to do. The TPP started with 4 countries, Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, and Brunei. And I was in Ministry of Trade and Industry, and I used to go around at every APAC meeting with an application form, knocking on Wendy Cutler's door and saying, can the US join TPP? Everybody looks at it, they're all very polite, but today it's the CPTPP. That's how I mentioned the ITA. And in the climate space, I see this all the time. Because there is no global leadership, because there is no consensus, governments are not willing to act. But parts of government are willing to act, and there's people sector and the business sector. Many businesses are pursuing many of these things. So I think we need coalitions of the willing, new ways of operating, organic ways of operating in a world that is not going to have a great deal of leadership. And I think climate will galvanize much of this action because it is a common threat. It binds us together in so many ways that we cannot deal with our problems without dealing with the problems outside our borders. And I think that will be a major change.
Thank you, Ravi. Listen, this has been so much fun on this panel, and we've gotten so many insights from our wonderful panelists. Can I invite you to join me in thanking them for all of their work?